I'm Dominikus. I'm a digital and generative artist and I live close to Munich in Germany. Over the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time doing web development with a focus on data visualization. I studied computer science, I did a PhD on that topic, and then I also worked as a freelancer in this area. And what's cool about data visualization is that you get to learn in depth about how the human visual perception works. So basically, this combination between your eyes and your brain. Since, of course, you don't want to inadvertently distort how people read the data, so you need to be aware of how we actually see the world. And on the other hand, you learn a lot about computer graphics, since you actually need to tell the machine how to create all of that possibly animated output. So you can imagine how my slide into art came pretty naturally, especially since I've also always been fascinated by computer graphics in general. I've been blown away by the projects that you can find in the demo scene, for example, or that you could find in the early digital art scene of the 90s and 2000s, or sleek video games, for example. While I've regularly dabbled with digital art over the course of my career, the last few years have me go more explicitly into that direction, first slowly, then with way more force and excitement. And what excites me the most from an artistic perspective is the basic concept of generative art and long-form generative art in particular. Since art is so often about strict control and perfect details, and basically about leaving a stamp the size of your ego on the world, but generative art forces you as the artist to let go. All of a sudden, the pieces become cooperations between you and randomness, a dance with uncertainty, if you so will. So instead of defining the color of every pixel, your job is to come up with rules and see how they interact to form a whole. So ultimately, we're not putting paint on a canvas or playing musical notes on an instrument, but our medium as generative artists is rules and systems. And these underlying systems, and I mean, in a way also the visual outputs, but mainly those systems, are our artistic contributions. What you find out working in this area is that shaping those rules and systems to produce things that you're intending to produce takes time. And it also involves staring at thousands and thousands of outputs, since in effect you're shaping an overarching multidimensional parameter space that those outputs come from. But on the other hand, you also get to feel extremely productive, since a single one of your algorithms can spit out more distinct and expressive pieces than you could ever create in your lifetime. But what I also really like about this approach is that the variety of outputs that an algorithm can create speaks to so many people. I'm often surprised if I take someone and have them look at 100 sample outputs from the system and ask them what their favorites are. And that tells you a lot about how different tastes can be. So I'm really happy if I manage to set up a system that manages to surprise me and others and hopefully also delight them. In my opinion, one way of looking at generative art is it's about creating a simulation with a set of rules and throwing in enough chaos and randomness to see something bigger emerge. And that is also at the core of my HYPERSCOPIC collection. HYPERSCOPIC's central theme is the emergence of overarching form from individual pieces. And this actually happens on multiple levels. The most obvious one is from the individual arrows that flow through each piece towards their central destination. You have all this randomness on the way, all these fluctuations, but they still end up in some orderly geometric place. But something else that's not necessarily obvious is that each of these arrows, again, consists of thousands of individual circles, squares, or triangles. And rendering them one after the other and adding a slight shadow tricks our eyes into merging them into these flowy arrows. And finally, if you look really closely, you might also notice a subtle grain that's on many of the pieces. Imagine it as the lowest rung, the quantum pixel noise that all visual order that you can see comes from. So as you see, the theme of emergence and order arising from chaos is central to this collection. My inspiration for this collection was the way we as individuals form groups and societies. Imagine the individual arrows as a person's moments going through their lives, shown in some hyperdimensional abstract space. They're probably changing all throughout, but keep working towards common goals and higher ideals, finally arriving at some destination. For certain groups and societies, it's an even flow with straight lines reaching their beautiful goals. For others, the individual's paths are filled with hardships that are incorporated into a constant fluctuation. The ultimate goals might unite everybody in a single form or end in a stable configuration with multiple clusters. But in hopefully rare cases, we also end up at overall conflict and confrontation that tears a society apart. So sometimes HYPERSCOPIC's algorithm produces these versus modes with individual arrows on collision courses captured right before the moment of impact. HYPERSCOPIC on a visual level is an exploration of perspective. So it's being rendered in pure 2D, but drop shadows and the arrangement of individual shapes creates a strong three-dimensional illusion. But since it's not explicitly 3D, it produces a slightly different feel from these actual 3D rendering techniques. Our eyes can't help but turn the gradients and shadows into a three-dimensional arrangement of flowing arrows covered in a weird shining material, but still something feels off. And this perceptual weirdness, this uncanniness, makes it hard to place the results in any existing context. It's hard to say if it was microscopic or macroscopic, but the pieces are not abstract enough to be beyond that. There's clear forms that merge into structures in our heads, but they're transcending scale altogether. And that inspired the name HYPERSCOPIC. When it comes to individual attributes of the collection, there's several that I'd like to point out. One central one is the main direction of the arrow's flow. There's a total of 12 directions to pick from, but the arrows have a slight tendency to come from the bottom and move towards the right. Another very obvious attribute is the existence of a frame around the piece. They come in different shapes and colors, and they help create a nice effect of the arrows lifting up from the background. Speaking about colors, colors themselves play a very central role in this collection. I've thought about going with the usual setup of manually creating multiple color palettes and have the system decide on one beforehand, but ended up doing something more challenging and interesting. I wrote a color palette generator that produces a unique color palette for every single piece. And there's several directions that this can go. So first of all, there's basically an opt-out from the color generation altogether. And this is when the system decides to create a monochrome piece. And I really like the starkness that this produces, the pale arrows lost on the black background. But most of the time, the palette generator does its work and creates a set of matching colors with the background color and either 1, 2, or up to 6 matching hues. Additionally, the rendering process itself has several options of working with the color palette. You often see these color gradients that gradually appear over the length of an arrow, and they might also be reversed so that you have color at the arrow's tips instead of their ends. That also sometimes happens. Finally, the placement of the arrows, the overarching shapes that they create. Arrows tend towards geometric shapes like polygons, so you have triangles, pentagons, hexagons, or you also get spirals from time to time. And another thing that you can see is that sometimes they also split up into separate clusters. But going back to this metaphor of societies, they might also end up in a more direct conflict, as we've seen already. And this is then the so-called versus mode, in which case the arrows face towards the center of the image in 2, 3, or 4 groups, as in this case, which creates nice symmetries from this underlying confrontation scenario, but that's beauty from impending chaos, I guess. Overall, I'm super happy and excited how HYPERSCOPIC turned out as a collection. It has so many parts and pieces and so much thought going into it, and I'm very, very proud of what I achieved with this collection and with those pieces, and I hope you enjoy them too.